Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's PermafrostNet seminar series. It seems most people have joined up, so it'd be good to get started. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Emma Street, who is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria, where she is supervised by Dr. Trevor Lance in the Arctic Landscape Ecology Lab. Emma has a Bachelor of Social Science from the University of Ottawa in Anthropology and Environmental Studies, and a Master of Environmental Studies from York University, where her research focused on the social, cultural, and economic consequences of thawing permafrost in Churchill, Manitoba. Today, Emma's research focuses on traditional knowledge related to permafrost and the socio-cultural implications of thawing permafrost in the Inuvialuit settlement region and Gwich'in settlement area. Emma, whenever you're ready.
Amazing. Thanks for such a kind introduction, Gabriel. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're calling in from across the country right now. As Gabriel said, my name is Emma Street, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria, where I'm supervised by Dr. Trevor Lance in the Arctic Landscape Ecology Lab. And I'm a student in PermafrostNet's Theme 2 group, which is a thematic group that focuses on the monitoring of permafrost change. And for the past few years, I've been working on a project in collaboration with the Inuvialuit Game Council, the Inuvialuit Joint Secretariat, the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board, and the Gwich'in Department of Culture and Heritage. And together, our research has been placing permafrost change in a longer-term context, and it studies the extent of thawing permafrost and its social, economic, and cultural implications. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, I'm really excited to get to share this project with you today. And if you have been along the journey with me with this work over the last few years, I'm excited to emphasize some of our methodologies today and provide a little bit of an update on our work. To begin today, I wanted to walk through the roots of this project and the methodologies that underpin this work. And to situate us, this project takes place in the Gwich'in settlement area in the Inuvialuit settlement region in the Western Canadian Arctic. And there are 8 communities in this region, including Sachs Harbour, Ulukhaktok, Paulatuk, Tuktoyaktuk, Inuvik, Aklavik, Fort McPherson, and Tsiigehtchic. And we know, of course, that this region within the continuous permafrost zone is facing rapid warming, which drastically has been impacting permafrost and is causing landscape change. We've learned a lot from studies in this area that have focused on the ecological and geographical aspects of degradation, but we know very little about the impact at community level. And addressing this research gap and answering this question of, so what are the implications and significance of permafrost change at the local level? It gives us an opportunity to amplify the voices of knowledge holders and shape research in this really holistic way. In doing this, this project draws on community-driven participatory research methodologies, wherein community members are engaged in all phases of the research process and its outcomes as full and equal partners. We've also been drawing as two-eyed seeing as a guiding framework, which sees Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing from one eye, sees from Western knowledge with the other eye, and uses both eyes together as a really holistic approach. And as such, this collaboration means that in the research design stage, our work involves co-developing research questions, interview procedures, and the research timeline together. And while conducting the research, this collaboration involves hiring local interview assistants, paying research participants for their time and their expertise, and reporting and receiving feedback on research findings from each community. Further, all data will be shared and held by research partners. And the second stage of this research, which involves informing responsive monitoring program, will be led by community priority needs. First goal of this project specifically is to document Gwich'in and Inuvialuit traditional knowledge of permafrost. I've been working at the local level with Hunters and Trappers Committees, HTCs, and Renewable Resource Council, RRCs, over the last couple of years to host interviews alongside local interview assistants with Gwich'in and Inuvialuit knowledge holders. In these conversations, we've been documenting traditional knowledge of permafrost together. And that kind of includes these conversations involving permafrost knowledge transmission. How did you come to learn about permafrost? Engagement of permafrost. How do you use or live with permafrost? And then the significance of permafrost change. Our second goal has been to map permafrost change in Gwich'in and Inuvialuit communities. We've been carving space in these interviews to document permafrost features and areas of permafrost change. And we've been conducting ethnographic mapping wherein areas of cultural significance, especially those with tied to permafrost, are marked on a map. In pursuing these goals, I've been really fortunate to have traveled to the 8 communities connected to this project, and we've documented 110 interviews among Fort McPherson, Inuvik, Paulatuk, Sachs Harbour, Tsiigehtchic, Tuktoyaktuk, Aklavik, and Ulukhaktok. And in following these interviews, these recording tapes were transcribed, and I've been using a software called NVivo to code and categorize all of the data into thematic nodes. And this process just helps us identify different patterns, connections, trends in the data. We've been using a mix of deductive and inductive coding methods for this analysis, which helps provide this early structure in the coding process, but then also allows us to have this flexibility beyond predefined codes and gives us this deeper understanding of the data. And we've learned a lot in combing through these data, and we'll talk a little bit more about those results in a moment. But in the vein of research methodologies, I just wanted to start off today by highlighting 3 foundational lessons that have been shared to me throughout this work. The first is that research is powerful, relevant, and impactful when it comes from a place of two-eyed seeing and community collaboration. I'm about to break a PowerPoint sin here by sharing a lot of text, but I just couldn't let myself slice or separate any words that were shared with me from a knowledge holder in Paulatuk, who is speaking to the reshaping of research and the recognition of multiple knowledge systems. They shared with us, by researching and coming up to communities and gaining traditional knowledge that's already doing a lot. Up until recently, I could say that many times traditional knowledge was never even considered. Now with this project, when you're talking to people and whatnot, you're not only academic but scientific knowledge, but also including traditional knowledge. And that's already for us, people and communities, doing a lot to help and doing whatever had to be done to correct problems, including incorporating traditional knowledge. We might not have papers saying we have degrees. I'm referring to the elders. But their knowledge, it's a lot of knowledge up there. Some of these elders could be professors. The second lesson is the importance of traditional knowledge dissemination and the documentation of knowledge for the next generation. John Norbert and Tsiigehtchic shared with us, it's good to have elders involved in every meeting because elders are the guys with the knowledge. They've been there, they've trapped all over the place, they've fished all over the place, they hunt all over the place. They know what's in the land and all that. It's very important that you put them up in every meeting that's going to happen because they have the knowledge. It's good that I'm interviewed today. I'm glad about it because there's not, while the elders are alive, get what you can out of them. You've got these young guys in school. We have to be here with them and we need to make sure they know the land, their land. It's their land, not mine anymore. I think we're forgetting a lot, and we have to put everything on the table for them. And the third lesson is the importance of ongoing collaboration and how critical it is to share data and report back to community, and the importance of making those reports and dissemination accessible. Calvin Pokiak and Tuktoyaktuk shared with us, what I'd like to see is whether if anybody comes and wants to talk to local people and see what's going on, come back and tell us what you've learned, what you've heard, and if you can, we can suggest some solutions. Don't just go back south and, be done. We expect people to come back to community and say, look, this is what we heard, this is what we learned, this is what we know now. And the question is, where do we go from there? Give it back to the people, the elected people, and say, this is what we've got so far. And down the road, come back with a final report and say, this is what I have for you. Don't just let it sit in the shop. I've seen that too many times. With this third lesson in mind, the seminar date is coming at a really interesting time in that I've just returned back from a trip to Tsiigehtchic, Paulatuk, and Ulukhaktok, where we were doing this reporting back to community. My body's going through it a little bit right now. I started last week in negative 45-degree temperatures, and I finished the week camping in a balmy 20-degree temperature on Vancouver Island. I think it's like 22 today, just outside the window here. So it's been a really strange week indeed. But I really wanted to hone in on what we learned in this trip and present Paulatuk as one of the communities where we were returning data to as a bit of a case study and just highlight what we've learned throughout this work and what the reporting back process looks like. Interesting enough, Paulatuk was actually our very first data collection trip, and I was first there between July and August of 2022. And it was really exciting to get to return in March with Alice Wilson, who joined from the Northwest Territories Geological Survey. And in hearing about the importance of youth engagement, we started out our trip at the Tsiigehtchic School in Paulatuk, where we hosted an afternoon of permafrost activities. We played with infrared thermometers. We practiced in ethnographic mapping and map biographies altogether. We looked at different aerial photographs taken of Paulatuk over like a 60-year window, and we played some permafrost term, definition, image matching games. We also held a meeting with the Hunters and Trappers Committee Board, as well as a broad community dinner to share updates and receive feedback on the work conducted so far. And one of the reasons that this is so important at this stage is to help make sure that I'm not misinterpreting information that's shared with me and that I'm presenting it accurately. And with positive feedback from the HTC and more broadly from community, I'd like to share what we've documented in Paulatuk specifically so far. The very first thing that was evident in all of the interviews we conducted there was that climate is changing in Paulatuk, and the effects have really been felt by knowledge holders in the community. One person spoke of the onset of climate change in the area by sharing, "Oh, 20, 30 years ago, it's a slow thing, you know. It just didn't happen. It was something that was happening for a long time. You noticed it a little bit here, a little bit there. And you put it all together and you know, back from the 80s and today, you see a big difference. You know, yearly, you don't notice it because it's just so little happens in 1 year. But add it all up and you know, it adds up to something big after a few years." Overall, the consensus was that summers were growing hotter, with reports of temperatures over 20 or 30 degrees for long stretches of time, shifting seasons, and thaw and ice breakup happening much earlier. In terms of permafrost knowledge transmission, it was really interesting to hear that while knowledge holders didn't learn about permafrost explicitly or by name, it was always something that they knew about and was part of the local environment. It wasn't until climate really started changing that discussions with permafrost started by name, by the term permafrost. And two knowledge holders, they shared with us, permafrost, I guess for a lot of us, is a fairly new concept. I mean, people historically have always dealt with permafrost, but you never really thought about it in that way. It's always just part of the land or part of the country. All they say is, when you go a few feet under the ground, it's frozen. Even in the summertime, permanently frozen. That's why I say before, global warming concept of this term called permafrost, which maybe I always thought that never gonna melt. Knowledge holders shared that permafrost is something that they grew up using, with refrigeration being the most significant way that knowledge holders shared that they engaged with permafrost. We learned about community ice houses. Two of them used to exist in Paulatuk, one by what is now an RCMP station, and a second closer to the church that was referred to as Father's Ice House in a couple of the interviews. And then we also heard about a personal ice house out at a whaling camp. And permafrost came up in these conversations as well as a foundation for building. One interview participant shared that they came to use permafrost in their work, setting up telephone and power poles in town. Each interview was very clear that permafrost change has been observed in Paulatuk, with all interview participants sharing observations of slumps and areas of erosion. One person shared with us, well, you see evidence of it when you're out traveling. You see the consequence melting permafrost has on the land. You see the erosion on the beaches, the shores, slumping when you're up in the hills, mudslides, you see all that. Even some of the rivers you notice are a lot higher because of all that water and stuff, even around town. You notice melting permafrost. You take a walk up around the outskirts of town, you'll notice permafrost has happened. Key affected areas named in Paulatuk in this work include spaces called Argo Bay, Billy's Creek, the Hornaday River, Thrasher Lake, and the beach, all around town, primarily on the north side of the beach of the bay. We had some reports of draining ponds and lakes related to permafrost change just on the outskirts of town. And with these changes, we really honed into these conversations of what are the impacts of this permafrost change, this broad so wet that drives the heart of this project. And in terms of these implications, we heard a lot about consequences to travel on the land. We documented reports of terrain becoming quite soft, the ground acting kind of like a gel, travelers sinking into the ground on their routes, specifically on bikes, ATVs. We had one person describe the ground kind of like an above ground pool, like the hard plastic ones that you kind of give a slap to and all of the ground would jiggle. We heard about like muddier terrain, and then we heard about erosion and slumping that started cutting into bike routes. One person shared with us that the trail looked like you could see the bike trail real good, and then it comes to an end right off the cliff. This photo here, for example, is just beside the Hornaday River, where dozens of feet have been lost in recent years. And this trail here was a remake of a trail that had already been lost and really popular route to get out onto the land. And of course, these hazards are a really big safety concern, but they also affect traditional routes that are used to go out fishing or hunting, berry picking, going out to camp just on the other side of the trails here. In terms of infrastructure, we heard about houses shifting and facing damage. There are a lot of reports of cracks appearing on walls or doors and doors jamming, and there are conversations around the need to adjust or change pilings. We also heard that while erosion in the bay around town is not yet affecting homes, it was a concern named for a little bit further down the line. In terms of the bay, there's some concern that the erosion there might compromise the road right before these houses, though this hasn't happened quite yet in town. And there's also discussion about the bay growing shallower. The deepest part of the bay is now about 12 feet deep and has been changing in recent years. The erosion in the bay has also started to affect an area called the Grotto, which is a sacred spiritual spot where community members, especially the elders, come to visit and pray. We also documented concerns for the cemetery in town and the cemetery at Cape Perry, where the burial sites of loved ones are being affected by coastal erosion. And one person shared the heaviness of this and saying, yeah, it's very concerning, eh? Yeah, you'd like them to rest in peace and not be disturbed. But right now, you've got no choice to start on the land around it. Yeah. And maybe I can share here as well, and pulling the curtain back on what it is to have this feedback and these conversations. As I was navigating in Vivo and all of the codes here, one of the thematic groupings we had was infrastructure. And how do we code something like the grotto or the cemetery, where, yes, maybe built environment, but represents so much more than perhaps what built infrastructure can entail. So this was a really helpful conversation with the HDC and community of how to reclassify these areas as spiritual sites and how to present those on forward. We also heard about food storage being affected through the study, which we've decided to classify as historical sites instead of this broad spectrum of infrastructure. And interestingly, in Paulatuk, it was a little bit of a unique circumstance where the main ice house, the one that was close to the RCMP station, closed in the 1980s, not because of damage to the area, but because of the introduction of electric freezers, newfound shipping capabilities, and electrical capacity in town. And it wasn't until after this switch that the ice house started to face deformation and really needed a closure and boarding up in town. And there's a really interesting mix of reports where some community members and knowledge holders have expressed grief of not having access to this traditional ice house anymore. But there are also these other reports for enthusiasm for different refrigeration options and technology. In terms of impacts on animals, we learned a lot about fish. We heard about material from slumps and erosion entering waterways, with one person sharing that they saw a pic of a landslide. There was a little creek there, a runoff creek, and now it's all mud covered in. A lot of use of the term like chocolate milk was used a lot in these conversations, and just the intensity of that mud. We heard a lot about like spawning grounds being affected, the idea that this sediment, this silt entering what traditionally would be a spawning ground. And then we heard about how heat in the shallower bay has been affecting char. Really these consequences on like fishing catching numbers, which has been going down since the 1970s. And this idea that meat has really been affected. A lot of reports of like a cream colored meat instead of like a traditional pink meat, and fish being kind of gummy, mushy, making it a little bit harder to dry or cook them. Lastly, in these conversations, we heard some interest in discoveries from permafrost, with one person expressing interest in like a mammoth skin that was found at Cape Perry in August of 2002 or 2003. And then a couple of people expressed concerns for greenhouse gas emissions coming from permafrost. Had some conversation around economic activities and jobs as well. So far, broad consensus was that jobs and employment have not been affected in Paulatuk because of this. But one person was very clear to say that they were concerned about development in town, like disturbing permafrost by building on it. So there's been a lot of knowledge and permafrost change documented as part of this project so far. And as we're beginning to move towards the end of this project, we've been thinking a lot about how to mobilize this knowledge, how to mobilize this like so what understanding that we've been documenting, and continuing to build upon it with a solutions-oriented approach. And with this in mind, we have this third goal of the project to document community perspectives of approaches to permafrost monitoring that are most aligned with local priorities and needs to develop responsive monitoring programs. Part of these reporting back trips has involved a knowledge needs assessment in select communities. And in this vein, it was also really helpful to have Alice Wilson from the Northwest Territories Geological Survey join for meetings on Paulatuk, for example. The NTGS is beginning a coastal communities permafrost mapping project with this goal of developing fundamental permafrost and geohazard data sets that will help support planning for climate resilient futures in coastal communities. And they're currently choosing field sites according to community concerns, and in collaborating with meetings like this, the work from this project can help inform the next iterations of solutions-oriented work. I can't say definitively where this will go, but areas like the grotto, for instance, were named heavily in this meeting of areas of concern, and where can a priority of a next project, when this moves forward, where can that sort of thing start? There's another initiative that's not exclusive to my work. I also really wanted to highlight today an initiative involving permafrost monitoring and a permafrost monitoring methods report. A group of PermafrostNet researchers and students met in Sydney, BC this past November for a workshop to discuss the various ways that we can monitor and understand permafrost. And our goal broadly was to put together a plain language report describing tools and approaches that are available to monitor permafrost and permafrost landscapes. And we've been thinking a lot about this output as a how-to guide for communities who are interested in setting up a permafrost monitoring project to address specific concerns, act as an informal guide for decision makers or policy makers who would like to learn more about permafrost monitoring and its applications. And in creating this menu of monitoring techniques, we've highlighted some of the opportunities, priorities, challenges each one involves, which can include things like cost, time, accessibility. And this work is still in progress, but it's exciting to think about how this can be leveraged to help inform responsive community monitoring programs and the next steps of where projects like this and other projects can go next. In terms of my world, my next steps include returning back to communities in May and June to continue reporting back on everything that we've learned and receiving this feedback, and then continuing to write all of this up, continuing on with the PhD, and then producing reports for community to come. With this, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for your energy today. I'm really glad to have folks here to get to talk about this with, and I'm excited to answer a bunch of questions. I'd also really like to say thank you to the people and the communities who have welcomed me to do this work together. It's a really enormous gift to get to be part of this project, and I really want to express my gratitude for the friendships and the lessons, all of the Bannock donuts that have come my way through all of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. That talk was excellent. I'd like to open the floor up to questions.
Hi, Emma. It's Tony here. Thank you for a lovely presentation. A lot of what you said, I guess I would have thought might be the way people thought about permafrost. I particularly like the fact that they sort of said, well, we never used to think about it. Now we're starting to think about it and we're worried about it. So I'm going to ask you, what was the most surprising thing for you that you found?
Really like this question because there's a bunch of I can choose a bunch of different streams. And maybe I'll start with, I had some assumptions. My master's was in Churchill, Manitoba, where a big part of the economy is dependent on the Arctic port, which had closed and reopened, the train line, which is closed and reopened. And I think I was expecting or had anticipated economy to be a really big concern for people in all communities, and came up maybe a handful of times in the 110 interviews. Broadly, the biggest result of that were people excited that scientific studies were hiring folks in community and not any negative consequences. I think that I was also really interested and surprised by the variations of engagement with permafrost and concern with permafrost. I think in talking to often youth groups, when I'm asked what my favorite thing about permafrost is or why I'm so interested in it, I think it's the sneakiness of it, we know that it responds very differently in different areas and can affect people differently too. So while Paulatuk is this case study, had very specific things about on the land travel or fish or not animals or not on the water travel, those things could have been opposite in other communities where needs and concerns were quite different. So I think that, that change among the 8 communities was really fascinating and surprised me a bit in that work.
Thanks. So if I can just do a follow-up. So you had this geographic distribution, which is also relative to temperatures of permafrost and so on, and ice rich, which I realize you haven't done all the analysis yet. And by the way, 110 interviews, that's amazing. But which community had the strongest concerns about permafrost? If you had to choose out of those 8, are you able to do that?
I don't think that I can. And I don't know if I will ever be able to quantify what is the strongest. Different concerns among the 8. And I don't know if they're comparable in terms of strongest. I think I would say that all 8 have really strong concerns. I also really want to highlight, though, that the 8 communities express their resilience. And yes, there's big changes, but we've done this before and we'll do it again, was a really resounding. And maybe that also, I don't want to say surprising, but is something that of someone who works in climate science and has been part of environmental conversations growing up, I think really encouraging of like, yes, doom and gloom and terrifying things, but resilient communities, we will be okay. Caught me off guard and brought me a lot of hope throughout this work.
Great. Thank you very much.
I have a question, if I may. Hi, my name's Jan Detman with the Yukon Geologic Survey. Really fascinating, I think, what you did. It's very new. I'm sort of more of a geophysicist, very different background. But so could you just comment on what you think are sort of the synergies of the kind of studies that you do with quantitative research when we think, about imaging or monitoring, those kind of nitty-gritty stuff? That would be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think is really rooted in this idea of two-eyed seeing, where I think that a lot of the methodologies that we often consider of Western ways of knowing, Western academic science, can tell us a lot of what is going on, what models can we produce, what can we expect on the ground. And I think the synergy of a project like this and the ability to work together is through this type of monitoring and knowledge documentation, we can understand the so what. Why does this matter? How does this affect people? I want to say, why do we care? And maybe I don't like that language, but what are the human level implications of it? And together, I think with the work that Alice Wilson and the Northwest Territories Geological Survey is doing, is that sort of so what can tell us of where next? What are the priority areas? What can we protect? If we're going to rebuild these new bike routes, where is a safe space? If we need to relocate houses or infrastructure or development, how can we do that in a good way that's relevant for community, safe for community, but also structurally sound? I hope that answers your question.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's great. I just wanted to comment also, I found this example of that grotto a fascinating one in terms of how you classify this infrastructure. It's really, really interesting point.
To Tony's earlier question too, grotto did not have that on my radar of significance. So big learnings about these very specific areas. And obviously that would be very unique to Paulatuk and not to other areas, and what it means for specific members of community in particular.
It looks like we have a question in the chat. Ian is wondering if any of the communities have any practices implemented to mitigate or amend the degradation of permafrost.
Yeah. Two things initially come to mind in the realm of traditional knowledge and sort of this mitigation or preparedness. The first thing is that overwhelmingly in these interviews, there was a lot of we never had to think about it. Permafrost was great forever. It was frozen. We didn't have to think about it, which obviously came with a lot of this nuance of people did engage with it, used it a lot, but just didn't use the same language that we might in traditional or in scientific Western language. But there's also a lot of practices of using a fish pit or a seal meat cache or some sort of temporary food storage in permafrost terrain, or a more permanent ice house community freezer. Folks would do things like pack it with ice or pack it with snow, open it up for ventilation, clear it out at specific times of years, choose specific areas to build these structures. And we can think about sod houses and the use of different pulses for storage. So I think about that of practices of mitigation, using but maintaining in a good way, especially with seasonal thaw and change. In terms of practices implemented to mitigate or amend degradation more present day, I would say to Jan's earlier question that there's a lot of community collaboration with paraglacial geographers, engineers on this, but is very much a new developing field as this change begins.
I have a quick question. I was wondering if there's any kind of, well, I know new developments always take some time to progress and get up to speed. I'm wondering if there's any pushback against, maybe pushback's not the right word, but any resistance to having to deal with climate warming and thawing permafrost. In the Western world, there are a lot of maybe climate deniers and things like that. Are there any similar trends in the communities?
I really like this question, and I think I come back to the school presentations or what it is to work with youth or talk to youth about it. I live in Victoria, BC. We're nice and sunny right now. I can go camping. I don't use permafrost in my day-to-day life. It's really hard to see, feel, bear the consequences of climate change where I live. And I think that can result in climate change blindness or denial, or perhaps buried conversations or engagement with the subject in Southern communities. I think that in Northern communities where we know the Arctic's warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world and has been since the 70s or 80s, there's not the same luxury or privilege to not recognize those things. And that was very explicit in all of the conversations we've had of like, nope, there are changes now, they're being felt. It's affecting my livelihoods in all of these different ways. And perhaps spectrums within or among the 8 communities of the consequence of that, but very firm of like, this is happening, we're going to be okay, but we need some work to figure it out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maria from the Climate Change Secretariat in Nunavut has a question. So in what ways have the communities combated issues with existing infrastructure, more specifically residential dwellings? And was there a community more affected than the others in this aspect?
Broad spectrum, and again, like 8 different communities, different infrastructural concerns. Inuvik, the hospital we know, the swimming pool we know, having like broad issues. There are a lot of like wood to steel piling switchovers happening in Inuvik right now that aren't necessarily the same practice or same infrastructural like pieces in Ulukhaktok or Sachs Harbour. Maybe in that vein, some of the ways that people have started to combat that. We know that there's thermosiphons and piling changes happening in Inuvik, a lot of really fast, like stilting changes, material changes in other communities. I don't know if I would classify as one community more affected than another in terms of infrastructural change, but would say that there's different concerns. ITH, we know, is a big piece of infrastructure that's a big concern for Inuvik, Tuktoyaktuk, and Fort McPherson, Tsiigehtchic to some extent, but just isn't the same sort of concern for Ulukhaktok, for instance.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was also a great question period. Everyone, please stay tuned for the next PermafrostNet seminar. And I'd like to wish everyone a good and safe day.